Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and due to a new version of Last Alliance Total War being released, I'm in with a new video breaking down the newest faction added to the mod, the Kingdom of Khazad-dûm. If you're new here, the Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2 set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War The Dawnless Days, a mod for Total War Attila set in the Third Age instead. As of making this video, the mod is in development, being in the version 0.3.0 alpha. That somewhat early in the mod's development cycle, there's still a fair bit of content in the mod, with several factions and a small campaign being ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, as I said, will be a faction breakdown, with me going over the history within both the books and films of Tolkien's universe of the Kingdom of Khazad-dûm before looking at the civilizations that inspired it in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the faction's units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles, as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. Now that you know what mod we're looking at and what the video itself is going to cover, let's start by going over the general overview of today's faction, the Kingdom of Khazad-dûm. Khazad-dûm is the primary settlement of the dwarves historically, being their massive city located underneath the Misty Mountains. Founded before even the First Age, the city would be inhabited by the Longbeard tribe of the dwarves all the way to the Third Age, at various points fighting in the wars against the forces of darkness and allying on and off with men and elves. By the end of the Second Age, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm would see combat in the War of the Last Alliance, the only significant force of dwarves to fight against Sauron, as apart from Khazad-dûm, very few dwarves fought on either side. At the conclusion of the war, the dwarves would continue to reside in their city and keep on mining, until eventually they unleashed an ancient Balrog from the depths of the earth, which devastated the kingdom and forced the dwarves of Khazad-dûm to flee to other dwarven settlements, the city being absent of dwarves for over 1,000 years, although at times the dwarves would venture near the ruined city, or even establish colonies, although to no avail. Eventually, however, after the destruction of the Balrog at the hands of Gandalf and the vanquishing of Sauron, hundreds of years into the Fourth Age, dwarves would be back in control of their ancestral city, possessing Khazad-dûm until the dwarves passed into history. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm, more specifically the descendants in the Kingdom of the Lonely Mountain, are very prominent in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings films and books, with examples such as Thorin's Company and Gimli of the Fellowship, though we never see in either version of both texts the dwarves who existed during the War of the Last Alliance. Though from what I understand, the new Amazon show, The Rings of Power, will show us what the dwarves are experiencing in the build-up to the War of the Last Alliance. At most, Khazad-dûm itself is very prominent, being a major setting in the Fellowship of the Ring book and film, while the outskirts of Khazad-dûm are seen in the Hobbit and Unexpected Journey film during the Battle of the Zanolbazar flashbacks. In terms of culture that may have inspired the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, while I can't think of any outstanding examples that correlate perfectly, the widespread Iron Age miners of Britain stand out to me, this culture most likely being one that Tolkien, given his historical knowledge of the British Isles, would have known about. Although the relative neutrality of the dwarves and conflicts in Middle-earth is reminiscent of Switzerland, the tenuous connection between the two growing stronger when you consider just how mountainous Switzerland is. With the history of the faction both in and out of the universe looked at, let's move on to the units themselves. Unlike the Dawnless Days, in which generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only having two generals, the Kingdom of Khazad-dûm also having two general options. The first of these two options is the Khazad-dûm Durin Guard, named after the founder of Khazad-dûm and the first dwarf to exist, Durin the Deathless. Looking at these dwarves, they're very much heavily armoured, each having a helmet that looks like a cross between a barbed ute of the late Middle Ages and a Viking-era helmet with a nasal guard and rings to protect the eyes, the helmet also having a rigid top which looks like those seen on Migration-era Spangan helms, and probably serves to the same purpose, stiffening the helmet. The look is finished off by geometric gilding, showcasing the warrior's wealth. Turning to their body armour, they wear very brightly coloured clothing, which is wonderful to see, over which they have their assorted mail or scale hauberks, over which they have plate folds and tassets to protect their legs, their torsos being covered in gilded plate cuirasses straight out of the 15th century. To protect their upper arms they have pauldrons and spaulders with plate round bases protecting the forearms, the lower legs being protected by greaves and metal shod boots with capes at their backs. Overall, while the armour looks quite good, there are several weak points, the gaps in the plate at joints not being protected by mail and their hands only having leather gloves for protection. Turning to the equipment, the unit uses octagonal metal shields, such shields not existing in real life, although the closest approximation would be Great Hoplon shields with their round shape and bronze covering. The dwarves' shields being decorated with symbols of the Kingdom of Khazad-dûm, such as the dwarven crown and hammer and anvil, as well as gilded mountains. Given how heavily armoured these troops are, shields would be quite superfluous, all things considered. However, their weapon of choice makes the decision to use shields make a lot more sense. For weapons, they use single-handed gilded warhammers that look to be made completely of metal, having a nasty backspike opposite the hammer portion. Such a weapon is actually really nice to see, given that most warhammers that we see in pop culture are absolutely gigantic monstrosities that would be impossible for anyone to wield, so seeing these relatively realistic examples brings joy. The choice of a warhammer for a weapon is a good one, given that these weapons are excellent at killing armoured foes by crushing them in their armour, swords of equivalent size being impotent against plate-equipped foes for the most part, It's for this reason that the shields aren't entirely out of place, as shields are useful for defending against armor-piercing weapons. So it seems like the dwarves, cognizant of the strength of their type of weaponry, took steps to limit their danger when turned against them by their foes. Turning to the unit officer, he is identical to his troops except that he has a crest with metal feathers atop his helmet, very much resembling the helmets of Roman centurions with their distinct crests. As a unit, these guys are your standard general option, being heavily armoured infantry that are highly capable of withstanding melee and ranged attacks, beating off or at the very least holding off most enemies with ease, although like all infantry the unit is vulnerable to cavalry and is slower and less dynamic than cavalry generals. Overall, a very hardy unit that I recommend making a general if you want to save a bit of money but still have a very effective general that will do well as an armoured reserve. Moving on to the second general option for the faction, we have Durin IV leading the Durin High Guard. Durin IV was king of Khazad-dûm around the turn of the Second Age into the Third Age, leading his kingdom into the War of the Last Alliance, Durin being considered the fourth reincarnation of Durin the Deathless. While Durin is never seen in the films or books, he's going to be a key character in the Rings of Power TV show. Looking at his troops, they were the same ornate armour as the previous unit and ditched shields, instead choosing to use large two-handed bearded axes with two heads, a weapon that's traditionally associated with dwarves. The axes seem to have shafts of black iron studded with extra metal for strength, while the heads are gilded. Bearded axes such as Dane axes are very much historic, however two-headed axes, especially large two-handed varieties, don't really exist in the historical record and are more a creation of pop culture, which makes sense given the immense amount of weight such a weapon would have for no reason. A cool looking weapon for sure, but not a historical one. Turning to Durin himself, he uses the same warhammer and shield as the previous unit and wears broadly similar armour to his troops, though his helmet is distinguished by a crown built into it, similar to many medieval examples of king's helmets, where the helmet and the body armour seem to have what I think would be ebony partially inlaid, or maybe even burnished portions similar to the Greenwich style armour of the Tudor period, the combination of the gilding and the black parts of the armour making for a very distinctive and imposing look. Overall, as a unit, Durin and his High Guard are very much a shock general unit, being a unit that you need to keep in reserve until needed, tearing through enemy ranks and attacks on the rear or flanks, being devastating in combat, having a colossal amount of armour which makes the unit as hardy as possible. As a general, I'd pick these guys over the previous unit due to how dynamic and late they are, their speed in changing the odds of battle being very much appreciated given that the faction as a whole is quite grindy, although the Khazad-dûm Durin Guard still makes for a good general, if a more laid back and cheaper approach to combat is what you want. Leaving aside the generals, we turn to the regular troops fielded by the faction, beginning with the first of their spear infantry, the Khazad-dûm Path Guard. Looking at their armour, they have the same rough helmet shape as those used by the general units, these helmets also being gilded, a good way of showing off the immense wealth of Khazad-dûm, to the point that even the lowliest of their troops have gilded equipment. To protect the rest of their body, they wear gambesons, a very common form of padded textile armour used during the Middle Ages. Steel-capped boots finishing off their appearance. For shields, they use roughly rectangular wood shields with metal rims lacquered in gilded covers, the shield resembling a cross between a pavese shield and a Roman scudum, pavese shields being a good choice given that they were commonly used by lightly armoured spearmen in the late Middle Ages. For weapons, they use spears with barbed wings designed to stop enemies from being pierced too deeply, the spears looking to be inspired by the winged spears of the 11th century. Looking at the unit officer, he has the same shield and spear as his men, but wears a mail hauberk over his padded clothing, plate, van braces and greaves providing significantly more protection. As a unit, these are your starting infantry, and are fairly decent, easily capable of fighting toe-to-toe with equivalent units, but having the major advantage of being able to form up in spear walls, meaning that they can easily fend off cavalry, something that other beginning units often are incapable of doing. These guys will make up the core of your army, and even once phased out by better troops, they're still very useful in a support role. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Khazad-dûm Gate Guard, who are quite a bit more well equipped than the previous unit. Looking at their armour, they have the standard dwarven helms as well as scale hauberks, with plate pauldrons, spaulders and van braces and greaves also being worn, the level of their armour reminding me of transitional armour during the 14th century. Like a lot of the second spear units in rosters, these troops discard shields and instead rely on their weapons and armour to keep them safe. Their weapon in choice used by these troops are halberds, with a spike tip for stabbing enemies and holding off cavalry, having a hooked beak on the back for dragging enemies and punching through gaps in armour, finally having an axe blade for hacking apart opposition. The halberd heads are gilded and the shaft has metal langlets along it, stiffening it and making it that much hardier and less likely to be broken, the bottom of the weapon being shod in metal too, perhaps for use if the head was broken off. Halberds are a massively popular form of polearm used during the 15th and 16th centuries, primarily, although they continue to see use for centuries more, the weapon all-around usefulness in most situations making it a common sight in armies. So seeing it used here is nice, its large size also meaning that the troops wielding it can't really use a shield. Seeing as the unit officer seems to be identical to the troops in the Khazad-dûm Durin Guard General unit, will jump into their role. These troops are a massive step up from the previous unit in all ways, still being significantly tougher despite not having shields to protect them. I recommend using these troops en masse as the bulk of your army in mid-game builds, where these guys can hold the line well and grind apart enemy units. Overall, a very useful unit that you should endeavour to recruit as quickly as possible. Moving on to the peak of the faction spear line with the Khazad-dûm Great Shields. Looking at their helmets, they resemble a fusion between the classical dwarven helmet and the really ornate examples of Phrygian helmets with beard-shaped faceplates. The beard portion of these helmets looking to be scale-shaped, which is quite cool. For body armour, they have the same equipment as the Khazad-dûm Duan's guard and use the same halberds as the previous unit, but also use shields, these shields being large wooden pavises decorated with the enamelled emblem of Khazad-dûm. The pavice as a whole is quite historical as it's made of wood with a thin layer of metal over the top, providing additional strength, something seen in real shields, although the metal rim is a bit off, given that it's not needed. While I would say that a pavice and a halberd being used at the same time is ahistoric, there is period artwork of troops being equipped as such, although just how accurate to reality they are is something else. The unit officer is only really distinguished from his troops by the gilded beard section of his helmet and his use of the standard dwarven axe. For a unit, these are the most professional spearmen the faction can field and are way more than a match for the professional troops of other factions, giving the elves a run for their money, which is how tough these guys are. If you can afford them, recruit as many as possible, as these troops can hold the line almost indefinitely. Before we move on to the sword and axe infantry units of the faction, there's one last special spear unit to look at, the Khazad-dûm Orc Hunters. Just by looking at them, you can tell these troops are different, given that they're both a range unit and a spear unit, similar to the horror of the desert fielded by the Khazad-dûm tribes. For armour, they wear a mix of scale and mail hauberks, with plate greaves and vambraces, lacking helmets and instead wearing furred caps. While furred caps are very historic and were used by warriors, they weren't used in battle for the most part, and if they were done so by lightly armoured troops, these guys being anything but, so seeing them skip out on helmets is very odd. These troops also lack shields too, and in addition to their spears, use gilded crossbows straight out of the 15th century, crossbows being widely used across the Middle Ages due to their ease of use in comparison to bows. Dwarves using crossbows is funnily enough only a creation of Lord of the Rings video games rather than the books or films of Tolkien's universe, as in the books, crossbows are never once mentioned, and in the films, only Uruk-hai is shown using crossbows, bows being the ranged weapon of choice of dwarves. Looking at the unit officer, he's a standard officer but with a crossbow. As a unit, these guys double as quite effective spearmen who can also loose off volleys of bolts as required. While they are useful in both roles and can quickly provide extra firepower or a wall of bodies as you require, I'd say this unit isn't crucial in dwarven armies and instead should be used as a support unit to beef up your armies. Overall, a useful unit but not a critical one. With these guys covered, all the spear infantry of the faction have been looked at, so we'll start with their melee line, beginning with the Khazad-dûm Tunnel Guard. Looking at these dwarves, they've got pretty standard armour that gives them good protection, having a mix of scale and mail hauberks combined with greaves, vambraces, and of course the typical dwarven helm. For shields, they use octagonal shields covered in a layer of metal similar to ancient Greek hoplons in appearance and role, the shield being a good choice for use with their level of armour, even if rounded octagonal shields didn't exist historically. For weapons, the dwarves use geometric short swords that remind me of a cross between the Roman gladius and Migration era swords, such weapons being good for a class of shield wars, with a smaller size makes them great at stabbing enemies. Looking at the officer, he's fairly standard, using the same sword and shield as his men. As a unit, these are the cheapest melee infantry that the faction can field, but are still very good, being a mid-tier unit which can deal out damage fairly well but is slightly more defensive oriented. When building armies, it's really up to you if you want to use these guys as the core of your more mobile striking forces, or if you think the next unit coming up is a better option, the Khazad-dûm Warriors. These troops are fairly similar to the previous unit, but there are some key differences. While they use the same armour, the shields are smaller, being in the range of a large buckler rather than a hoplon, and are also convex. Convex shields being very common in history due to their better protectiveness. For weapons, these troops use single-handed war axes with metal shafts, the axes being fairly similar to the ornate examples of late medieval European axes from the 15th century, as well as Persian axes from the early modern period. The officer is identical to the previous officer, except for his shield and axe, so we'll jump into the unit role. On the battlefield, these troops are the axe equivalent of the Khazad-dûm Tunnel Guard, but more of an effective offensive unit with stats still reflected. Just slightly more expensive than the previous unit, either one is a great choice to have in mid-tier armies, which is why I said that it's really up to the player what they prioritise. A more offensive yet all-around good unit, or a more defensive yet all-around good unit, both putting in great work against equivalent and lesser foes. Personally, I say that because the faction already has great defensive options with its spear line, the axe unit is probably a slightly better choice so as to give you enhanced hitting power, but again, either will serve in a pinch. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Khazad-dûm Hammerers, who are equipped identically to the Khazad-dûm Duan Guard, is that they use giant warhammers as their weapon of choice. While warhammers are a very much historical weapon, warhammers like these are straight out of fantasy. Such weapons would be incredibly difficult to even hold, let alone wield in sustained combat, which is why real warhammers are one-handed weapons the size of an actual hammer rather than these monstrosities. However, I understand that seeing dwarves without such massive weapons could be misconstrued as a letdown in a fantasy world, so I'll begrudgingly let it go, but not really. The shaft of the weapon is metal, and is then bound by even more metal, which given how heavy that solid head would be, is probably necessary, for a head and the shaft being gilded like all dwarven equipment. Skipping the warhammer wielding officer, these guys are shock troops, extremely hardy shock troops capable of shrugging off attacks be they melee or ranged, before smashing into enemy formations. Incredibly destructive troops against most foes. I keep these guys in reserve and deploy them where necessary, making sure to keep them away from cavalry as they are vulnerable to mounted charges. I'd also advise against attempting to hold the front line with these troops, primarily as shock troops aren't the best at defending, and these guys are no exception. Overall, a highly offensive unit that complements the defensive nature of the faction and gives a lot of rapid hitting power. Moving on to the final melee unit the faction fields, we have the Khazad-dûm Mithril Warriors, who are armoured identically to the Khazad-dûm Durin Guard, using a mix of dwarven axes, swords and hammers, which is nice to see, combining them with the standard large octagonal shield, the officer looking like his troops. As I'm assuming from their name, the troops are either equipped with mithril equipment or guard the mithril mines themselves inside Khazad-dûm, mithril being one of, if not the rarest metals in Middle-earth, found only under Khazad-dûm and being capable of being forged into the hardiest armour and weapons in the world. If these troops are equipped with mithril, be it arms or armour, their stats reflect it, having incredibly high stats to make them capable of fighting even the most professional and elite of enemies to a standstill, if not overpowering them completely. As a unit, these guys will be the striking arm of top-tier armies, working well in combination with elite spear infantry to pin down enemy units and then tear them asunder. A great unit, make sure to recruit as many of them as possible. With this unit covered, all of the faction's melee infantry have been looked at, so we'll move on to the ranged units of the faction, beginning with the Khazad-dûm Merchant Guard. Wearing gambeson as their main armour, these light troops lack other armour, instead wearing fur caps or hats that resemble Russian ushankas with a crest on it. The hats very much resembling the ushankas used by Soviet authorities and troops during the 20th century. While helmets would be better for defence, given that these troops aren't meant to be seeing melee combat, the hats make sense from a comfort reason and help distinguish the unit, which is good, given that a lot of the units in the mod look very similar to one another. On their backs they have the standard octagonal shield, shields often being slung over crossbowmen's backs so that they could reload with their back to the enemy and lower the chance of being fatally shot. For weapons they have axes at their side in case of melee and a standard crossbow. Looking at the officer, he's the same as the Khazad-dûm Path's guard officer, except that he uses a crossbow. As a unit, these are your starting range unit and as such are a critical component of early armies, giving you the ability to contest your enemies when it comes to ranged combat. These troops are far better than the early skirmishes fielded by other factions due to these guys' superior range, which is always appreciated. I very much suggest amassing these troops in the early game so as to thin out enemy formations before transitioning to better range units, although as useful as they are, keeping them out of melee is a priority, as though they can somewhat handle themselves against rabble, anything else will slaughter them. Stepping up, we find ourselves facing the Khazad-dûm crossbowmen. For all intents and purposes, these are the ranged equivalent of the Khazad-dûm warriors, sharing the same armour and officer, using crossbows and backslung shields. These troops are your mid-tier ranged force and as such are easily able to defeat rabble units and mid-tier orc units, their armour allowing them to survive missile exchanges far more favourably than the previous unit. I say they're a match for most units of their level, although elven archers might prove more of a challenge. Overall, a great unit that gives the faction extra firepower and the ability to fight off greater foes. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Khazad-dûm Engineers, who have armour and shields as well as swords and axes that we've seen before, but are distinguished by their ranged weapons, a pair of small one-handed crossbows with what appears to be a pistol grip of sorts. Small crossbows are known from their historical record and sword use, although more in a civilian personal weapon sort of role, or as an assassin's weapon rather than on the battlefield. I also don't think people dual-wielded them like pistols akin to a gunslinger, so while it's a cool concept, it's not very historical. Sipping an officer who's much of what we've seen before, these guys are a short-range crossbowmen who aren't great in melee. What this means is that you've got a unit that's essentially a skirmisher unit, but is still fairly expensive all things considered, but can shoot very fast. Overall, I personally wouldn't use these troops, as while they can send a lot of ammunition downrange at the enemy in a short period of time, they're outranged by other ranged units, meaning that they're inherently at a disadvantage when they enter battle. The unit's needing to close with enemies to fire, meaning it's vulnerable to being caught in melee, which the unit isn't equipped for. A somewhat useful gimmick, but that's all it really comes down to with these troops. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Khazad-dûm Heavy Crossbowmen. Armoured identically to the Khazad-dûm mithril warriors, these troops have a pavese slung over their back and use large crossbows. Pavese shields were especially associated with crossbowmen due to their large size, allowing crossbowmen to turn their backs and reload or being placed on the ground as movable cover for crossbowmen, seeing heavy use in late medieval Italy. However, when crossbowmen are as heavily armoured as these dwarves, shields aren't needed at all, so they could very much do without them. Skipping their identical officer, these troops are the professional tier ranged forces of the faction and as such are a clear shoo-in for any elite army, possessing great range and hitting power while being capable of fighting mid-tier infantry and melee, making for an all-around great unit that should very much be recruited en masse as the core of your range strength. Moving on to the final unit fielded by the faction, we have the Khazad-dûm repeating crossbowmen. Bearing the same armour as the previous unit and having the standard octagonal shield on their back, these troops have a quite unique weapon, a repeating crossbow with a cylinder on the front of the weapon where the reloading mechanism is. Repeating crossbows are actually a historic weapon, existing in China for thousands of years, though they weren't really considered a primary weapon and were more of a civilian defense weapon. That said, while the idea of repeating crossbows is historic, the ones in the mod aren't, being very much a creation of pop culture and being a steampunk weapon. Such weapons actually exist today, although more as curiosities, rather than as actual implements of war or hunting. Skipping the officer, this unit is a bit of a weird one all things considered. Stats-wise, these guys have lesser range than the previous unit, but shoot a hell of a lot faster, while also being just slightly better in melee, meaning they have a very definite different battlefield role. Personally, I consider using these guys as a supplementary force for your late game armies, hitting them at long range with the heavy crossbows before shooting them at close range with the repeaters. A useful unit, but not one that's ultimately necessary for Khazad-dûm, all things considered. With these guys covered, every unit in the faction has been looked at, so let's move on to the faction as a whole. The Kingdom of Khazad-dûm is a faction that has a very defined playstyle, fielding elite troops by comparison to the competition at every level, having a very much defensive-oriented playstyle. The game plan for these guys is to absolutely rain down ammunition on enemies before grinding them to dust with your elite melee infantry, the strategy really being the only viable one the faction has, given that it lacks mobility as it has no cavalry units whatsoever, meaning elite dense infantry blocks are the way to go. The most immobile faction in the game, even more so than the Numenorian factions, these troops play very distinctly, which helps separate them from the other factions in the mod and makes them that much more interesting to use. With all that said, my breakdown of the Kingdom of Khazad-dûm is over, and up until more changes are made to the mod, this will be my last video in my series breaking down the Last Alliance Total Wars factions, although battle videos and army builds should be coming up. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's greatly appreciated. This is your host Jakov, signing out.